Greetings, travelers. This is Historian Erud, and I'm back with another EQ lore video. Today, I'd like to actually get into a topic that piqued my interest after watching another YouTube content creator's video by the name of Zaid, and he was having a discussion with another longtime EQ veteran and knowledgeable lore expert by the name of Liverflap, and they were talking about the origin of the Frogloks on Kunark, which really got the wheels in my head turning. I had not heard or even really pondered too much about the distinctions between the two. As a child, just Frogloks, whatever. I didn't really get into the geopolitical and socio-political aspects of EverQuest, which is one of the most fascinating components of the game. And a lot of the lore is actually told through the game in extra game sources. So what actually prompted me also to make this video was a post left on a forum on the EverQuest Daybreak forums by a user by the name of Jevax, Jevax. So shout out to him, shout out to Zaid, shout out to Liverflap for helping inspire this video. And so I'm going to read a little bit of this individual's concepts on the social organization of Frogloks. So let's just take a look at that really quickly, and then we're going to kind of, because he actually posed some very interesting questions, which I believe I found sources that would answer the questions that he has. So let's start off with, I'm not going to read his entire post. It was a very thorough treatise on the Society of Frogloks, but we're going to read a bit of it. So here we go. What follows is a lore discussion of elements of Froglok culture that I personally find interesting. The Frogloks, like some other cultures present in Norath, have a very socially stratified system, denoted by their use of words like Gaz or Krup as a type of group title. This even bleeds into elements that players in the role of Guktans have access to. Their newbie armors, their trainers, their leaders, all use these elements of Froglok culture to establish who a player is among them. So for those of you patient enough to pursue, okay, we'll just skip that part. Very interesting to note about this is that very observant of him to see the distinctions between these titles, Gaz, Krup, etc., and kind of make an association of castes. His theory is actually slightly off about how the casts are constructed, but amazing observations for just, playing the game and then, coming to these conclusions, which obviously the developers intended you to conclude, which we'll see in the sources that I provide shortly. Froglok cities and communities. Oh, before we move on, very important to note for my P99 players, players who only played Classic, quit before the Legacy of Yakesha expansion, Frogloks became a playable race during that expansion. So that's very important to note. I'm not sure if he mentions it or if I'll read it in the portions that I read, the excerpts that I read out of his treatise, but we'll see. But I just needed to note that for you guys. Okay, Froglok cities and communities. Even beyond the physiological changes that came from Mithanel Mar's blessing of the Guktans, the race of Frogloks is not socially homogeneous. Very important. I'm going to get into the Mithanel Mar's blessing and all that momentarily. Indeed, the different settlements of the Frogloks are spread out over two continents, southeastern Antonica and eastern Kunark. In both locales, the Frogloks prefer to inhabit swamps and jungles, but beyond such superficial similarities, their society display a wide array of differences. The Antonican Frogloks, both of Guk and Gukta, so Guk being, let me finish reading. Both of Guk and Gukta are devoted to the Lord of Valor, and while we do not have much information on the religious practice of the Frogloks of Krup, the Kunarkian city in the Swamp of No Hope, we do know that the Frogloks of Sebelis worship Trakenon. Likewise, the Sebelician Frogloks work in Congress with their ghoulish members, while the Antonican Frogloks are in an unending war with their cursed members. They do have shared caste system names, which is the next topic for discussion. If you are interested in the caste specific to each of the 4 notable civilizations, they are listed in Appendix A. Beyond that, Froglok of Guk and Gukta are willing to work with adventurers, while those of Sebelis will eternally be hostile, and for some reason, the Frogloks of Krup are not willing to treat much with adventurers either, even Guktans. So a very important note, you have the city of Guk, what we call Upper and Lower Guk, Upper Guk being inhabited by the living Frogloks, and the Lower Guk predominantly under the control of the undead Frogloks, who came to be, I don't want to rehash it because there's plenty of lore videos out on the history of Guk, but they came to be through a curse, and they're at war with the living Frogloks and any other races that may venture forth into Lower Guk. Then you also have a city known as Old Sebelis, which was once the city of the Ixar. It was the capital city of the Ixar Empire. I'm not going to go into detail on that. There's plenty of lore videos on that. But you also have an outpost in the Swamp of No Hope, which he calls the Kunarkian city within the Swamp of No Hope. It's very similar to Kelethin, like a tree city type construction. So in the Kunark manual, the EverQuest Ruins of Kunark official strategy guide, it states, Krup lies somewhere in the midst of the swamp. It is the capital city of the Frogloks of Kunark. King Lupslup is rumored to be found in this area, defended by a large number of Frogloks. So that's very interesting to note as well, because here we have a name of a king, King Lupslup. I looked him up on the P99 bestiary, as well as the Alakazam bestiary, or should I say the P99 database, as well as the Alakazam bestiary database, and I could not find an NPC by the name of King Lupslup. But however, there are NPCs that we do not encounter, which I'll be doing later videos on, that are mentioned in game, but we never see them. But I digress. Let us continue onward with Jivax's Tristis. Scrolling down now, Froglok casts. One of the most interesting aspects of Froglok culture is their caste system. Note, in other sources, these are listed as tribes or titles, but considering these sources are a bit apocryphal to this setting, this work will stick with caste as a middle ground. I mean, there are a lot of discrepancies between what is canon and what shouldn't be considered canon. Just for future reference, or just to understand my framework of thinking, if it's licensed, I would consider it canon unless it's contradictory to some very foundational truths that we see. Well, in-game obviously is the most canon that you can be. Then the external sources that were written, I consider them canon if they're licensed, unless they contradict in-game or a higher ranking canon source. Other than that, if it's licensed, I accept it. But considering the it's an argument. It's an argument. Let's just leave it there. I don't want to belabor that. They are classed by these castes, but their exact meaning seems to vary by specific culture. The Guk, Krup, and Sebelis Froglok seem to have a hierarchical structure, with Gaz, for example, denoting less powerful Frogloks. Gaz Frogloks can be knights, shamans, squires, warriors, and wardens. Among the Guktans, however, these castes denote classes. A Gaz is a rogue among the Guktans, while a shaman would be of the Yun caste, etc. The different groups also have different specific to each. See Appendix A, etc. Okay, well, I'm not going to continue further with some of these other aspects of, which are very fascinating reads. If you get the opportunity, I encourage you to Google and look this up. But there are some very fascinating revelations, should I say, spoke about. But I wanted to get to the final questions and thoughts. Actually, before we get to the final questions and thoughts, I want to kind of segue by explaining my theory as to how the Frogloks, who were originally from Antonica, arrived in Kunark. So, first I would say this, that the theory posed by Zaid was that because we know that the trolls have some very significant seafaring presence, we see it in later expansions, Legacy of Yakacia, etc. You see the Frogloks near Otis. We see them, traveling the seas. And we do know that the Frogloks were enslaved by the trolls and for a great deal of time. And so the idea is that the Frogloks were transported as slaves from Antonica to Kunark, and then that's how they arrived there and were later enslaved by the Ixar predominantly, and later on follow tracking on, etc., etc. But here's my counter theory. So the theory ties into the lore pertaining to the Frogloks defeating the clan Yakacia within the halls of Guk and basically expelling them out and taking over and taking control. When this occurred, there was an event pertaining to the deity Mithanel Mar, the Lord of Valor, who basically enhanced the Frogloks. Not just, just gave them power, but physiologically changed them as well. Empowered them in such a way that they were no longer the race of Frogloks they were before they were imbued with his power. And I believe that once that occurred, that enabled the Frogloks to branch out. They had a base of operations, basically a capital on the continent of Antonica, and they were believers of Mithanel Mar, which is not far removed from the city of Freeport, which is also a city where we see Mithanel Mar worship. And here's a quote from Mithanel Mar let me read an excerpt actually from this lore. While the bulk of the crowd stares, mesmerized by the movement of the flames, several of the listeners begin to make out an image. It steps out of the flames and speaks only to them. There are some among you that see my true form. You see me, for you are the chosen. I speak to you because you have found true understanding of yourselves. It is only through the understanding that you may march forward and dispel the dark grasp of fate. You shall carry with you the destiny of your people and act as beacons for those who will wait safe from the hate and fear that surround you. You will be the lance of valor that pierces the heart of those seeking to oppress your people. You are the seeds of a new age. And I believe that new age was foretelling of the Frogloks' rise and ability to not only defeat the trolls of Grub, but also the trolls of Guk rather, but also to expand their influence. And so this is a little bit of theory crafting, but let us now take a look at the Inathul Swamp, the map of Inathul Swamp, where the trolls and the Frogloks are located. You also find Frogloks in Wrath Mountains, etc. But this is, at least in classic EverQuest, the primary region where we would encounter both of those two races. And we see to the south, we have Grob. To the west, we have the Firot. And to the north, we have the southern desert of Ro. And to the east, we have Upper Guk, or the old ruins of Guk. And so south of Guk is Grob. The reason why I utilize this map is to show you that you can exit out of Guk, and head north into the desert of Ro, which would take you to the cities of the humans. But even beyond that, as a Froglok, you wouldn't want to go west because you wouldn't want to have to deal with the ogres and lizardmen that reside in that region. potentially. And you wouldn't want to go south because your enemies are to the south to Grob. And if you would like to expand, maybe not be confined to that one area, because there's only one exit out of Guk. They can't tunnel out through the south because you have the undead Frogloks there. So their only hope of salvation outside of holding the fort, so to speak, would be to travel to the north into the deserts of Ro. Now, when we look at the oasis of... Oh, sorry. That's actually not the map. Well, no, let's look at that map first. When you look at Grob, you see Grob right here to the south, all the way at the southeastern tip of Antonica. This is the continent Antonica. To the north of that is the swamp, right? So we seen that Guk was in the north region of Inathul Swamp, northeasternish region. And then when we look to the north of there, we see the Oasis of Mar, Desert of Ro, Freeport, etc. Right? And to the west, we see Ogok, right? The Firot, right? So north of where, when we're looking at the maps, the Frogloks, they can escape north from Guk into southern Desert of Ro, travel from southern Desert of Ro into the Oasis of Mar, and into the Desert of Ro, Freeport, etc. And this is where they can come in contact with a port, a major port city. But even beyond that, before that, when we as players first are able to travel to Kunark, it is via two ports, or two docks rather, if you want to call one of them a dock. But the Butcher Block docks would take you to the city of Firionavai, or Firionave, however you pronounce it. But the way from Antonica, and not Fadewar, would be in the Oasis of Mar. There's a little dock. If you see that number 2 right here on the map, there's a little rectangle to the right of that near the number 1000. That is a dock. That dock takes you from the Oasis of Mar into Tomorrow's Deep, which is the Kunark region. And so the Frogloks, via escaping from South Ro, which is just north of Inathul Swamp, would have enabled them to, the same way us players travel, this if we were going from Guk to Tomorrow's Deep and we didn't have a port, we would run and we would migrate the exact same way what I would presume that the Frogloks traveled in order to reach Guk. Sorry, not Guk, Kunark. So that's my counter theory as to how the Frogloks arrived to Guk. But I want to do more than that. I wanted to address the final thoughts and questions posed by Jevax, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So I'm going to read his final thoughts and questions, and then I'm going to provide a source with the answers to that, and we'll wrap the video up with that. Final questions and thoughts. Pray, forgive me if this section is just a collection of unanswered questions, but unasked questions are more likely to remain unanswered. Good point. First, what are the castes technically? Can Frogloks aside from Guktans move between them beyond just being promoted, being top promoted? Going to answer that question. We do have an answer from for that question in the lore. But let's read the rest of the questions, because I'm kind of going to answer them by revealing the source and information. In Kunark, why are there 2 distinct factions for Krup? The faction you can raise in Old Sebelis, but no existing members, and Frogloks of Kunark, which no one can raise. Another great question. We're going to answer that. Also, the Frogloks of Sebelos have an odd exception. There are Guk and Krup castes, named for their capital, but not a Sebelos caste. Is Ilis, I-L-I-S, the Froglok name for Sebelos? Great question. There's an answer for that. For the Guktans, will the monks ever get a caste? I have no answer for that. That's not going to be something that we find in prior lore, but future lore more than likely. And since Lukta is a thing, we could assume so is Luck, but none can be found. The only reference to the name is the Lost Kingdom of Luck, a group of Frogloks in the Plain of Storms, which is weird. that is a very fascinating topic and a very interesting investigation that I plan to do so later on, God's willing. I'm going to make that attempt. But that is a great point. I would just note, just on a surface level, the reason why you wouldn't find them probably anywhere else is because they're a lost kingdom. And so maybe that kingdom somehow made their way to the Plane of Storms and got stranded there and got lost in the annals of time. Potentially. But let's look at your last two questions. What are the Zukta Frogloks? Do any Rukta Frogloks exist? Or for that matter, Zuk or Ruk? So I have no information for your last two questions. But the previous questions that I do have answers for, I will provide you those answers now. Hopefully you get to see this video or somebody shares this video to you. And hopefully others can actually contribute to this topic. Please leave your comments down below if you know the answer to who the Zukta frogs are, who the Ruk or Rukta frogs may be, or the lost kingdom of Lok. I'm going to do my research, but as of right now, I can only provide my preliminary information that I came across. So here we go. We have what's known as the Monsters of Norath, which is basically a book that explains stats. Like if you're going to do the EverQuest tabletop, this book would be a resource for you in planning your campaigns and what have you. But they contain significant details regarding the Froglok. So we're going to read the Froglok section real quick. We're going to scroll on down here to the description, which contains a great deal of the answers to the questions, and also confirming a lot that Jevax had noted in game and through his research. So here we go. Frogloks are a reclusive race of frog-like humanoid creatures that inhabit Norath swamps and underground abodes. They generally prefer to be left alone, but it is not unheard of for them to trade with some of Norath's races. So there you go right there, right? Before we even go any further, let's take note of that these Frogloks, they're sentient beings. We know that they have some high degree of intelligence because we see them as wizards, we see them as enchanters, we see them as necromancers, and so Shadow Knights. These classes require intelligence for you to be able to even practice those professions or schools of magic, rather. But they also trade, which is something to be of note, because if you just looked at it on face value, the Kunark expansion never came out, you would just think that the frogs just basically stayed in Guk and they went nowhere. That's what I thought back in the day. Although you could also note there are some Frogloks in Kinos sewers, Kinos catacombs, the sewage region under Kinos City. But it's just them. It's not like it's a official place of habitat or whatever have you. But they trade among the other races of Norath. So it's important to note that they did not, this would denote that they did not stay isolated within Guk, that they actually traveled. All right, here we go. Since ogres and trolls feast on small Frogloks from a young race, however, Frogloks will either attack or flee from those races on sight unless an individual ogre or troll has somehow proven itself friendly. In addition to in addition to dozens of scattered tribes throughout Norath, Frogloks have two large kingdoms on the known continents. All right, so the kingdom of Guk lies in southern Antonica near Inathul Swamp. Remember, that's the dungeon of Guk. The Froglok nobility of Guk lead their kingdom through several dire threats. All right, so we see now that there's some form of monarchy in their social structure, right? Which is somewhat different than a caste system like they have in real world India, for example, right? The Froglok nobility of Guk led their kingdom through several dire threats. The trolls of Grob pose a constant danger to Guk, but the more dangerous enemy lies far below the surface. In the deepest caverns of Guk, legions of Frogloks have been cursed with a form of ghoulish undeath. The lower reaches of Guk often clamor with battles between the living Frogloks and the undead brethren who seek to claim all of Guk as their own. Froglok nobility carries a confusing array of titles. All right, so this is getting into your first question about, let's go back to that. His first question was, what are the castes? And inquiring about being able to move between them. All right, so this next portion right here is going to address that. Froglok nobility carries a confusing array of titles, which are generally earned through one's ability rather than through heredity. All right, so these are titles that you can earn, right? You can have some forms of achievements of valor, which would make a lot of sense because the primary body of Frogloks prior to their migration of Kunark and the introduction of Trakenon and whatever they're worshiping over there, they worship Mithanil Mar, someone of valor. And you would have to perform deeds of valor to earn the respect of of a follower such as Mithanil Mar. So, definitively answer your question, they can move between the castes. Although, as with all societies, some Frogloks of inferior prowess are promoted for political reasons, right? So there's that too. Okay, so which is the element I love about EverQuest. Like, there's not just this. There's so much gray within the world, in the political structure, the social structure, the religious structure. It's just beautiful. But let's continue. In ascending order of importance, these titles include Tuk, Gaz, Ton, Vis, Shin, Shita, Tal, Nocta, Tanta, Su, Tal, Erd, Dar, Van, Kor, Yun, Zol, and finally Guk, for those nobles who receive orders directly from the king. Okay? So that's an important socio-political distinction regarding their structure, to answer your first question. Outsiders who seek to deal with Frogloks are best served to recognize these stations to avoid breaches of diplomatic etiquette. All right, so these are not savage, ignorant amphibians, right? These are very sophisticated, intelligent, socially organized amphibians. So that's the Antonican Guks. Now we're going to discuss the Guks of Kunark. The other major Froglok Kingdom, and that's important because when we're dealing with my theory on the Frogloks, they came over there with their organization intact, which we're going to see further as I delve further into Froglok society. But we're going to see that their structure is intact when they come to Kunark, and that they actually build. They didn't just come over there and, take over some cave or whatever. They built a city akin to Kelethin, right in the Swamp of No Hope. So this is not just a group of ignorant slave frogs who have been slaves for trolls for generations, and then came over and knew nothing but what the trolls taught them, and then somehow escaped the Ixar. Like, I don't think that's consistent with what we already know to have transpired, right? Here, the Frogloks are beholden to Trakenon, their great dragon ruler. I'm sorry, let's start that again. The other major Froglok kingdom lies below the ruined Ixar city of Sebelis in southern Kunark. So now we're talking about a different city. So we have two Froglok cities on Kunark. Because according to the EverQuest Ruins of Kunark guide, the Krup capital city is in the Swamp of No Hope. And we know that although Sebelis is not far from the Swamp of No Hope, it is actually located in Trakenon's teeth, and not in the specific region that we know in game or zone that we know in game as Swamp of No Hope. Okay. So there's actually like 2 major cities if we want to get technical for the Frogloks. But according to this record here, we're starting off with the city of Sebelis, which was once the capital city of the Ixar before the Great War between the Ixar and the Ring of Scale, or the Sebelisian Empire and the Ring of Scale brought an end to the Ixar rule of that city, and Trakenon taking it over and what have you. But we'll read more about that as we go on. The Frogloks of Sebelis are more aggressive than their Antonican kin, sallying forth in great numbers to expand their empire throughout Trakenon's teeth into the Swamp of No Hope, and even to the very walls of the Ixar city of Cabalus and the High Elf outpost of Firiona Bay. Now, important to note, the usage of the term empire, right? So the Frogloks are an actual force on the continent of Kunark. Sebelis is a high-end raid zone, probably the second highest end raid zone in Kunark, next to Vishan's Peak. So we know that they're a formidable group on the continent, and not just some escaped slaves hiding somewhere. The Frogloks of Sebelis. Okay, I'm sorry, I read that part. Well, let me read it again because I paused. The Frogloks of Sebelis are more aggressive than their Antonican kin, sallying forth in great numbers to expand their empire throughout Trakenon's teeth into the Swamp of No Hope, and even to the very walls of the Ixar city of Cabalus and the High Elf outpost of Firiona Bay. The Frogloks of Sebelis are awarded noble titles similar to their kin in Guk, with the additions of such higher titles as Bok, Jin, Krup, Ilslis, and the highest station, Reet, for those powerful ones who hold audience with Trakenon himself. So this answers one of the other questions that JVX had, which was pertaining to the Illis being a Sebelis name. And yes, that is correct. It is a Kunarkian Froglok name. And to be clear, the Frogloks of Kunark are the Krup, the Krup Frogloks. But I believe the Illis are representing the Sebelisian Frogloks, or that major city, and the Krup capital city would be the city in Swamp of No Hope. And we're getting a hierarchy with the Frogloks closest, because they're the Krup. These various different Frogloks are attached to one another, as we're going to continue to see. Even though there are 2 distinct factions, as noted by Jivax, which I'll get into as we go further. But they're attached to one another. They are one group, and these titles are mostly borrowed from their original culture as Guk frogs. But when they came over here, they adopted a new title for themselves. And it appears that the frogs closest to Trakenon have the highest or are higher in the hierarchy than the other frogs within the Kunarkian frog society. The closer to Trakenon that they are. All right, so let's move down, because there's some couple of things we need to note here. Shin Frog. Most Frogloks who reach the title of Shin have proven themselves fierce warriors. Some who have become Shin have trained as shamans or knights instead, but these tend to be leaders within a group, bolstering the Froglok combatants with their magical abilities. So, all right, so that's, the Shin Frogs. We see them in Upper Guk all the time, right? But very important to note is that this is a title, right? Yun Froglok. Frogloks who continue to demonstrate their ability to promote to the Yun cast. All right, so they get promoted. And we actually see the term cast there. So let me correct myself. That cast is an appropriate term. So kudos to you on that, Jivax. But we're actually getting the rationale behind it, and how if casts are fixed or not, which they clearly are not. They are knowledgeable in matters of healing herbs and poisons, and they can blend the forces of nature, etc., etc. We're gonna move on. I'm sure this video is getting very long, and we're getting close to the conclusion, right? So we're not gonna focus on the Shin. Let's look at the Jinn Froglok. Frogloks who are recognized early as having great innate magical ability are well schooled in the spiritual path of the shaman, although some have their talents turned to wizardry. Eventually, such Frogloks become quite powerful in their magical arts. These are Jinn, right? Jinn Wizard. All right, so let's take a look at the Krup Frogloks, right? Because these are just subcategories. Krup Frogloks are high-ranking nobles. So when you hear noble, is denoting some type of monarchy, right? Who often oversee entire Froglok communities and lead Froglok armies to battle. Krup Shadow Knights are most common. They compromise the majority of the defenders of King Lup's court. So there we go. We see his name again. For instance, although many Krup ascend to this caste through one of a number of spell casting professions. All right. So we got the Krup Enchanter, Krup Shaman, Krup Wizard, Krup Shadow Knight. But now let's take a look at the Illus Froglok. The Illus are the true ruling class of the Frogloks. While the Reet title is a higher honorific, and the Illus would cede to the Reet's command as the voice of Trachanon, in pragmatic terms, the Illus rule the Froglok nation, and Froglok kings are chosen from among the ranks of the Illus. All right, so a lot of information there, and kudos to you once again, Jivax, for posing this detailed treatise on the subject matter, because it's very fascinating. The Illus are the highest of ranking Frogloks, and kudos to you to note that you didn't see them in Guk, but you do see them in Seb. But there's also something to note there, which you would probably be very fascinating to know, which is that the Reet have a higher station at least in the eyes of Trachanon, and by proxy, Trachanon being almost a deity to the Frogloks, or a demigod or of some type. But very important to note that it's almost like a church and state kind of thing, where you may have let's say prior to Victorian England, like you had the Catholic Church, which had their leader, and you had the King of England, who was a monarch. However, until the King of England ceded from the Catholic Church, the authority of the church was a little bit higher than the king. The king wanted a divorce. The church said no, and that was that. He had to start his own church in order to then be able to do what he wanted to do. And so the church was able to tell a king no. And so that's kind of how I conceptualize the concept between the Illus and the Reet. But let's continue, because we're getting close to the conclusion here. Reet Frogloks serve as attendants to Trachanon. Though the mighty dragon seldom makes use of them, the Reet remain on call to serve him and protect their inner lair from unwanted guests. The Reet act as Trachanon's voice among the Froglok nations on Kunark, and are sent across Norath on obscure missions by the prescient dragon. All right, so they're even while they're on Kunark, they're willing to travel across Norath, and so the capabilities of the Frogloks to arrive to Kunark, to me, is quite evident when you look at the totality of the circumstantial evidence. But regardless, we were able to answer a significant amount of the questions regarding social organization of the Frogloks. So we know how what the castes are, right? We know how one can move between them. So to explain the two distinct factions of Krup, I'm kind of gonna go back to the explanation with the Reet and the Illus. at least how I'm conceptualizing it, one faction is dealing with the nobility of the Frogloks, the nobility that's probably descending from the Frogloks of Guk, and then the other faction is the Frogloks within Sebelis who worship Trakenon, whose loyalty is devoted to Trakenon. It doesn't matter about, previous stations, or, the frogs are beneath them anyway. So it doesn't matter anything about their monarchy and hierarchy. So there's two political components there, like one being one religious and one being nationalistic, or pertaining to pride within the monarchy and what have you, in connection to the monarchy. And so that's pretty much all the questions. We answered the questions dealing with the Illis as well. So thank you, Jivax, for posing that question on the forums. All you lore divers, please jump in the comment section, share your thoughts on my theories, as well as my answer to the questions. And also, if there's any other content or topics relating to lore within EverQuest that you want to see, or questions that you may have that you want to find answers to, please leave your comments in the comment section. I will definitely try to get to them in the order that I receive them. And happy hunting, adventurers. Peace.